Once again, I would like to welcome you to the second day of this conference. Again, like yesterday, I would say it's definitely it's a bit of a sadness in the heart seeing the condition of COVID as it is all over the country, and with everybody facing this problem within their family, friends, and among us in the hospital and among patients also. So it's a tough time, and I would say all of us have to be strong and brave and fight this. And as I said yesterday also, life has to go on. Since we had planned this event 3 months ago when things had been on the ebb, we were not expecting it to come back so fast and so soon. Let's hope that it goes down as rapidly as it has increased. With that, I will hand over to Dr. Vaishali to conduct the proceedings for today. Thank you, Dr. Vaishali.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So good evening, everyone, all the faculty members and my dear audience friends. I'm Dr. Vaishali Zamre. I'm one of the members of the organizing team for this conference. So yesterday we had a wonderful discussion on various, different breast cancer profiles like hormone receptor positive, HER2 positive, and triple negative, and we had some wonderful, panel discussions as well. So today we are going to, on the second day, I welcome you all, and we're going to, in the next 3 hours, we are going to listen to our experts talk on various aspects of breast cancer. That's breast cancer beyond routine management, like the reproductive health of breast cancer patients, bone health of breast cancer patients, and Dr. Aparnadhar is going to talk on the liquid biopsies, and there are going to be some interesting talks on sentinel, various aspects of sentinel node biopsy, the newer aspects of surgical management of breast cancer, and the session 3 will consist of the way forward in radiation in breast cancer. So this entire 3-hour session event is going to be divided into 3 sessions, and I would request all of you to be with us for the next 3 hours and experience this wonderful academic event. So with this, without wasting any further time, I would actually invite our chairpersons for this session, ma'am, Dr. Kanika Gupta, who is the Director of Gynae Oncology at Max Hospital, Vaishali and Patparganj, Dr. Kavita Jain, who is a Senior Consultant Pathologist at Max Shalimar Bagh, and Dr. Sandeep Batra, who is an Associate Director Medical Oncology at Max Super Speciality Hospital, Saket. So over to the chairpersons.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Vaishali and Dr. Arun and Dr. Dinesh for conducting this good, organizing this good CME on breast, because I think whatever is happening, learning should go on. We cannot stop the learning. And when we talk about learning, it's when where the treatment has started long back for CA breast, where they used to do surgery and used to take out whatever possible, including the, I'm not a breast surgeon, but pectoralis muscles and everything. And then they came down to limited surgery, the breast conservative surgery. और जैसे कहते हैं चाहतों का अंत नहीं है, तो अब हम लाइफस्टाइल की भी बात करने लग गए हैं, और अब हमारी चाहतें वहां तक पहुंच गई हैं कि हम असिस्टेड रिप्रोडक्शन की भी बात कर रहे हैं इन पेशेंट्स के साथ. So let us hear from the main person, Dr. Anshu Yadav. I welcome her to speak up on this topic and let us know what she thinks about it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you to all the faculty members. So I'll be sharing my screen. So good evening, everyone. The topic for today's evening is assisted reproduction techniques in breast cancer patient. Myself, Dr. Anshu, a DM resident in reproductive medicine at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. So I'll be covering the topic under the preface: cancer statistics, effect of chemotherapy on ovary, pregnancy after breast cancer, why fertility preservation is needed, what all fertility preservation options are available, various committee recommendations, what are the challenges in hereditary cancers, and the conclusion. So the Globocon 2020 says that breast cancer is the most common cancer in the reproductive age women, and it is the most common diagnosis for which oncofertility referrals are being taken. That is accounting for 34.5% of the cases. The situation is almost similar in India. Still, the breast cancer is most common, affecting 1 in every 4 women every minute. And out of that, 48% of the women are in the reproductive age group. So, what is the effect of chemotherapeutic drugs on the gonads? The chemotherapeutic drugs have a burnt out effect. As you can see, this is the normal physiology in which there is a balanced regulation of the PI3K, PTEN, AKT pathway, which has an inhibitory primordial recruitment. So, but the cyclophosphamide exposure leads to the activation of this pathway, which is not the normal. And so there is more apoptosis of the granulosa cells, and there is decrease in the AMH, leading to the reduction in the apoptotic response and more primordial follicle recruitment and their atresia, leading to the damage of the ovarian reserve. So, depending on the treatment-induced amenorrhea, we have divided the gonadotoxic treatment into the risk categories, depending on how much they lead to amenorrhea. High risk being 80% risk of amenorrhea, intermediate risk 40 to 60%, and low risk less than 20% risk of treatment-induced amenorrhea. The cyclophosphamide-based regimens, which are most commonly used in the breast cancer with anthracyclines or taxanes or alone, in a woman who is more than 40 years, she comes under the high risk category. So age is such an important factor, and the women of 30 to 39 years, she comes under the intermediate risk, and the women who is younger, that is less than 30 years of age, she comes under low risk. And the targeted agents like trastuzumab, tamoxifen, and GnRH analog, they are very low or no risk to the fertility of the women. So these things need to be addressed. Now, this is a recent review in which cancer treatment related infertility is studied in terms of amenorrhea at 12 months post chemotherapy treatment. And the most of the chemotherapeutic regimens in the breast cancer were studied, and it was seen that the anthracycline cyclophosphamide taxane regimen is most gonadotoxic, leading to the treatment related amenorrhea in 54% of the cases in the women who are more than 40 years of age. So it is a very much high risk to the fertility of the women. So what all are the chemotherapeutic factors influencing the gonadotoxicity? Age. Older women have a lower primordial follicle pool, so the risk of gonadal damage increases with age. Then whether we are giving a radical versus an adjuvant chemotherapy, whether a single agent versus a combination therapy, as we have seen, combination therapy have a more detrimental effect on the fertility. And it is a dose dependent effect. The more the dose, the more the effect. And for how much duration the dose is given. So that can lead to the menstrual problems, that is amenorrhea, chemotherapy related amenorrhea, or premature ovarian insufficiency, further leading to infertility. So effect of chemotherapy on the ovarian reserve can be measured under either clinical, that is amenorrhea or premature insufficiency and infertility. The hormonal measures are AMH, FSH, estradiol, and inhibin. But AMH is the most common marker, which shows a marked and rapid fall well before the other markers, that is the ultrasound markers like the antral follicle count and ovarian volume. But we should take it with a pinch of salt. Pre-treatment AMH to predict the post-treatment recovery of the ovarian function. And it is not an indicator of the post-treatment fertility. So, but it should be the marker to be done before starting the chemotherapy in a reproductive age women. And if AMH is less than 0.5, then the value of fertility preservation is unclear according to the recent guidelines. So the impact of cancer on subsequent chances of pregnancy. This is a retrospective study of around 23,000 patients in less than 39 years of age. And they have seen that the cancer survivors were reported as 38% less likely to be pregnant as compared to their age match controls. So in the another study, the pregnancy after breast cancer, it is a multi-center prospective cohort study in reproductive age women. They have seen the pregnancy within 5 years of diagnosis. And to the surprise, the women who are less than 30 years, there is just 23% chances that they'll be spontaneously pregnant. And the women of the age 36 to 40, there are significantly lesser chances, that is only 5% of getting spontaneously pregnant. So we can assess the detrimental effect on the fertility. So why fertility preservation is needed? Because there is an improved survival rates for young people with cancer, and gonadal dysfunction by the cancer therapies is an important issue to be addressed. And preservation of gonadal function should be the priority for long-term healthcare of the cancer survivors, because then we'll have a loss of opportunity for fertility, and we have established fertility preservation techniques to preserve their fertility. So all the leading cancer committees, that is the ESCO, ESMO, and the NCCN, and the leading reproductive medicine committees, that is ASRM, ESRE, recommend that we should address the possibility of infertility as early as possible before the chemotherapeutic treatment start. We should refer the patient to express an interest in fertility preservation to the specialist, and we should document this discussion in the medical record. And for the adult women, we have embryo and oocyte cryopreservation, which are the established methods for fertility preservation. And we have flexible ovarian stimulation, that is the random start protocols for oocyte collection to delay the timing for the start of chemotherapy, and aromatase inhibitor based stimulation protocols to counter the supraphysiological estrogen levels in the hormone sensitive cancer. Ovarian tissue cryopreservation is still under research settings. So for a women, we should assess the risk for infertility. We should communicate it with the patient. And if the patient is at risk of treatment-induced infertility and she has an interest in fertility preservation, then we should offer her embryo or oocyte cryopreservation. Now, what are the patient concerns regarding this fertility preservation? Whether it will lead to upstaging of the tumor. It's okay with upfront surgery followed by adjuvant chemotherapy. There is a window of opportunity of around 6 weeks in which fertility preservation can be done. But with neoadjuvant chemotherapy, there is a risk of delay in starting chemotherapy. So what are the chances of pregnancy with oocyte and embryo cryopreservation? Till how long they be freezed? What are the risk of, is there any risk of BRCA gene transmission to the offspring in the hereditary breast cancer? So what fertility preservation strategies are there? With IVF, we can freeze the embryos or the oocyte depending on the patient age, whether she has a partner or not, what type of therapy is to be given, what is the potential to spread, whether it is an emergency or a planned fertility preservation, and how much time is available before the chemotherapeutic treatment. So what are the challenges with the fertility preservation techniques? We need to collect sufficient number of oocytes within a limited time frame. And that is very challenging because safety issues, like we need to increase the number of oocytes also so that there are better chances of pregnancy. But we need to counter the complication like ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome also, because that may have a potential impact on the underlying malignant disease. So for this, we have GnRH antagonist protocol, that is a short duration of stimulation lasting for 10 to 12 days, and GnRH agonist as a trigger to counter the effect of OHSS, and tamoxifen and letrozole based protocols in hormone sensitive cancers. So embryo cryopreservation is the most established technique for fertility preservation. It is to be done in a post-pubertal female with a committed male partner or using donor semen with consent. So the women should be informed about risk of losing the reproductive autonomy and possible issues with the ownership of the stored embryos, because embryos are the joint authority of the couple. Not a single person can seek their authority. So coming to the live birth rates per cycle start. As you can see, the live birth rates in a women less than 35 years, they are significantly good. That is 46.8% and decrease as the age advances. Now, oocyte cryopreservation, it is for adolescent girls, that is unmarried reproductive age group females or electively by married female. Actually, there is a choosing between oocyte and embryo cryopreservation. Women should understand that embryos belong to the couple. In case of separation or no consent from the partner, embryos cannot be used. So we should give her an option to split her oocytes to attempt both embryo and oocyte cryopreservation. In case of marital discord in future, she has the chance for fertility preservation. Now, the ovarian response to stimulation in fertility preservation. In case of oocyte cryopreservation, it is seen that the women with malignant disease have a lower number of oocytes retrieved after controlled ovarian hyperstimulation for fertility preservation. Now, because there with the controlled ovarian hyperstimulation, there are supraphysiological estrogen levels. So we need to administer one anti-estrogen in the hormone-sensitive cancer, like the breast cancer. Either it can be tamoxifen, which is a selective estrogen receptor modulator, or letrozole, which is an aromatase inhibitor, along with the start of the gonadotrophins, so that it can counter the supraphysiological estrogen, which is in thousands, to the values which is in hundreds, and we'll give this till the day of the trigger, and then we can do the oocyte pickup, and then again we start it after the oocyte pickup till the day her serum estrogen levels fall to less than 50, then she can undergo the chemotherapy. So this is the IVF protocol. We start the gonadotrophins from day 2 of the cycle. Nowadays, random start are also there. And then when the follicle reaches the level of 14 millimeter, or the E2 is more than 250, because in this case, we are giving her aromatase inhibitor, we administer a GnRH antagonist to counter the premature surge. Then a trigger is given and her oocytes will be picked. So letrozole is found to be superior to tamoxifen in treatment of advanced stage breast cancer, and it has a potent long-lasting suppression of E2 levels. So there is unlikely that it will increase the recurrence of breast cancer. So this is similar regimen, just letrozole is given in place of the tamoxifen, and then it will be again restarted on the day of pickup. So this is a paper in JCO which has showed that letrozole is preferred because it results in lower E2 levels, so which are more favorable for the hormone sensitive cancers. Now coming to the GnRH agonist therapy. GnRH agonist is the only pharmacological means of ovarian protection during chemotherapy. Okay, so as we all know that it works by down-regulating the GnRH receptors in the pituitary, but there is no hormone receptors in the primordial follicles. So GnRH agonist does not prevent the primordial follicle loss. So it has no role in preserving the ovarian reserve, but it just decreases the vascularity, they say, and so reduce the concentration of the chemotherapeutic agent, but its efficiency is still controversial. So what is the utility of GnRH agonist for fertility preservation? They say that it reduces the follicle burnout by reducing FSH release, but it is still controversial. Inhibits the cyclophosphamide-induced and Bax-mediated apoptotic pathway of the granulosa cell, so that inhibits the decrease in the AMH. But it helps in reduction of the severe vaginal bleeding during the chemotherapy. Also, it has a psychological benefit. It can be combined with other methods of fertility preservation, but there is a lack of biological plausibility. And we must understand that AMH is just an indirect marker of the ovarian reserve. It may underestimate the damage due to chemotherapy. So the leading committees, that is the ASRM and the ESCO, says that GnRH agonist should not be considered an equivalent or an alternative option for fertility preservation, but can be offered after cryopreservation techniques or when they are not possible. So it is not a FDA approved, it is an off-label use. It reduces the risk of premature ovarian insufficiency, but does not preserve the fertility. So menstruation does not mean that she is fertile and she is able to bear the child. Decreases the menorrhagia risk. So it is not a replacement for the fertility preservation methods, that is the oocyte and the embryo cryopreservation. If you have nothing to offer, then you at least offer this. So it is to be given, if we are giving leuprolide, then 3.75 milligram intramuscularly 1 week before the start of the chemotherapy, and continue every 4 weeklies within 2 weeks before or after the final chemotherapy. There are two preparations which are established and to be given. That is goserelin, which is a subcutaneous preparation in the dose of 3.6 milligram. These both are depot preparations. Now, what are the special considerations in the BRCA mutation? Hereditary breast cancer accounts for about 7% of the cases. 80% out of them are BRCA mutations. So BRCA1 and 2 are the repair genes, and there is a risk of ovarian cancer associated with them. So 44% with the BRCA1 and 17% with the BRCA2. So it is representing family planning should be completed by the age of 35 to 40 years, followed by prophylactic salpingo-oophorectomy in BRCA1. But it is a difficult decision for a woman to weigh risk-reducing surgery against a desire for pregnancy. So what all are the options available? All the options, that is oocyte, embryo, and ovarian tissue cryopreservation, are available for these patients, but there is a potential to pass on the mutation to their offspring, 50% chances. So there is a need for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to diagnose the mutation. Trophoectoderm biopsy on the day 5 embryos can be done, and the embryos which are found to positive for the mutation can be discarded, and only the unaffected embryos can be transmitted. And it is seen that BRCA1 mutation carriers have been found to have a reduced ovarian reserve as compared to BRCA2 carriers. However, the response to the stimulation is not significantly different. Now, pregnancy in a breast cancer survivor. Ideally, 2 years after treatment completion, because usually the recurrences are to be happened in this time frame. 5 years after treatment completion, if she is on any endocrine therapy like tamoxifen, that is found to be teratogenic, and there is a no increased risk of recurrence during pregnancy in treated cases, even in the hormone sensitive breast cancer. So pregnancy per se does not increase the risk of recurrence. So what are the barriers for fertility preservation? There is lack of awareness and communication, fear of delay in chemotherapy, shorter window of opportunity, the cost involved, because these fertility preservation methods are not included in the insurance coverage. And at our AIIMS ART center, oocyte, embryo, and semen cryopreservation are being done for oncofertility cases also. And also ovarian tissue cryopreservation is to be started under a research project that is approved under Professor Neena Malhotra. And the cost of IVF is quite subsidized, that is 60,000 per cycle. Cost of freezing is just 5,000 per year. So I'll conclude with that your breast cancer survivor after 5 years might ask you, doctor, why didn't you tell me to freeze my eggs? And there is a lost golden opportunity. So fertility needs to be addressed prior to chemotherapy. Timely referral to a reproductive medicine specialist. Established treatment options should be offered to a willing women. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, Dr. Anshu, that was quite a educative and informative, crisp presentation. One question, as far as I know and the literature suggests,
Yes, sir.
the use of GNR analogs is for the fertility preservation. One of the patient came to me inquiring, Doc, does it prevent the premature onset of menopause? So I
Sir.
tried to find the data, but could not convincingly find anything regarding that.
Actually, they say that it does not have any role in preventing the ovarian reserve loss. But okay, it is fine that it can delay the premature menopause. If menses is just the issue, then you can consider this as a modality. But for fertility preservation method, it is not an established method, and it should not be replaced with embryos and oocyte cryopreservation. If fertility is an issue, if just menses is an issue, then you can consider in patients, but that too also resuming the menses post chemotherapy, even with GnRH agonist, it is just in 30 to 35% of the cases. So the efficiency is still controversial.
Okay. No, my question was, does it prevent the early onset of menopause, which is so characteristics of chemotherapy is about 30 to 80% incidence of premature menopause by drugs like anthracyclines or taxanes?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, actually, it is not well evidence proven that we can say it's, in the literature also, there are only 30 to 35% chances that it will prevent the premature onset of the menopause. Because as I showed that in the mechanism, it has no role in the primordial follicle. It just decreases the vascularity and its efficiency is just controversial in preventing the premature menopause also.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anshu. Nice. Dr. Kanika, any comments from your side?
Nice. So it was really a beautiful presentation, and I'm a gynae oncologist, so I do understand this subject also. But as an oncologist, sometimes we are forgetting this major issue for the patient, which at the time of diagnosis she doesn't realizes, because she is also in a hurry to get treatment done for the cancer surgery or chemotherapy. But later on, when she realizes, it is too late. So it is our duty to understand this subject and introduce to her at that point only, when she has been diagnosed, what is to be done regarding the future fertility.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So
Thank you, ma'am.
I think we will move on to the next talk then by Dr. Tushar Patil on bone health in breast cancer patients, role of oncologists. Dr. Tushar Patil is a senior consultant medical oncology at Sahyadri Hospitals, Pune. Welcome, Dr. Tushar. Please deliver your talk.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, Tushar, you are.
So I think bone health is one of the most important aspects of adjuvant treatment and in the metastatic setting of breast cancer management, where close to in the adjuvant setting, we are seeing it in postmenopausal females or in patients where ovarian suppression has been done. And in metastatic setting, close to 60 to 70% of them would present as bone metastasis sometime or the other. And management of this becomes an issue in terms of what we say as quality of life, especially when the pelvic bones and the long bones of the leg are involved. And definitely it makes a lot of difference in terms of quality of life if we can manage it really well. Let's see the impact of the hormonal treatment in bone health in cancer patients, breast cancer patients, especially. As we can see, AIs in postmenopausal women, the higher risk of fracture from 2% to 9 to 10% when ovarian function suppression and AIs are given in premenopausal women. So the increased incidence of fracture seen in these patients as we come down on the estrogen and try to negate it definitely makes a big impact. If we see the incidence of fracture in patients receiving AI therapy as compared to not receiving AI therapy, as we can see, for per 100 person years is from 6.36 to 8.6, so close to 35% increase in this incidence of fracture in patients who receive AIs. Now, regarding the drugs or the medications which we have, apart from supplementation of the calcium and vitamin D, which are very important in managing this bone health, two drugs which we all have been extensively using, zoledronic acid and the denosumab, the rank ligand inhibitor. Now let's see the data about all these two drugs and then probably a comparison also. Regarding zoledronic acid, this was a meta-analysis which I could find in 2017, the Oncologist journal, where the purpose of this study was to estimate the impact on survival and the fracture rates both by the use of zoledronic acid versus no use or delayed use in the adjuvant treatment of early breast cancer, stage 1 to 3. 15 studies were considered eligible for this and were analyzed. And this data showed that the use of zoledronic acid does result in a clear-cut or some significant better overall survival outcome also, where 5 studies reported a hazard ratio of close to 0.81. There was no significant differences which were seen in the disease-free survival outcome or the incidence of bone metastasis happening, but there was also improvement in overall fracture rate seen in treatment with zoledronic acid as compared to the no use with a hazard ratio of 0.78. With the use of zoledronic acid, the rate of osteonecrosis of the jaw was close to 0.52. This study concluded, this meta-analysis concluded that zoledronic acid as adjuvant therapy in breast cancer patients appears not only to reduce the fracture risk, but also probably offer some survival benefit over placebo or no treatment. And it had an implication for practice. Zoledronic acid appears to have a role in the adjuvant treatment of patients with breast cancer, as it reduces the fracture rate, seems to offer survival benefit. But the need for additional research is essential to determine if its effect is enhanced in low estrogen environments and reveal the magnitude of this interaction between the estrogen and the zoledronic acid. Meanwhile, patients with signs of bone loss, that is osteopenia or osteoporosis, during adjuvant endocrine therapy, when the initiation of bisphosphonates is indicated, this drug, zoledronic acid, might be preferred over other therapies because of its beneficial effect on survival. Regarding the second drug, which is a RANK1 ligand inhibitor, denosumab, the dose of 60 milligrams in the adjuvant setting, and we have this study way back in 2008, randomized trial of this denosumab in patients receiving adjuvant aromatase inhibitors for non-metastatic breast cancer, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 study carried out over a 24-month period in hormone receptor positive stage 1 to 3 patients treated with adjuvant aromatase inhibitors. They were randomly assigned to receive either placebo or subcutaneous denosumab 60 milligrams every 6 months. And at enrollment, all patients were required to have evidence of low bone mass. The primary endpoint being the percentage change from the baseline in the lumbar spine bone mineral density. As we could see, even at 12 months, there was a 5.5% difference in the bone mineral density at the lumbar spine. At 2 months, it increased to 7.6 as compared to the placebo, thus giving the denosumab arm a favorable outcome. The increase in the bone mineral density actually were seen as early as 1 month. So that was also one of the findings of this study. The adverse events reported in this study, both in placebo and in the denosumab arm, were almost comparable. Arthralgia, pain in the extremities, back pain, fatigue, constipation, cough, insomnia. Some grade 3, 4, 5 adverse events were seen in few of these patients in both the arms. There was no treatment-related serious adverse events. There was one death reported in both the arms. Overall incidence of the treatment-related adverse events remained similar in both the treatment groups. The second was the adjuvant denosumab in breast cancer, ABCSG study 18, multicenter randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial again in non-metastatic patients receiving AI aromatase inhibitors, and all postmenopausal females with early hormone receptor breast cancer who were on AIs were included in this. Close to 3,425 eligible patients were enrolled into the trial, out of which 3,420 were randomized to receive either denosumab or placebo subcutaneously every 6 months. Here, the primary endpoint was from the randomization to the first clinical fracture, occurrence of first clinical fracture. As we can see in this diagram, the number of fractures compared to number of patients in the placebo arm 176 versus 1709, and in the denosumab arm 92 out of 1711, giving a hazard ratio of 0.5. Very impressive, significant improvement in bone health, mineral density, and reducing the risk of fractures for these patients. So definitely it improved in this subset of stage 1 to 3 carcinoma breast postmenopausal females who are receiving adjuvant endocrine therapy as AIs. Again, the adverse events were comparable, and there was no serious multiple grade 3 or 4 adverse events which could be seen with the addition of denosumab. So this study of adjuvant denosumab in postmenopausal females, disease-free survival results from a randomized trial were also seen, and you could see that Kaplan-Meier analysis did show some disease-free survival in the intent to treat population as compared to the better disease-free survival as compared to the placebo arm. At 5 years, as we can see, 89 versus 87%, and even at maybe 8 years, it's 80.6% versus 77.5%. So numerically, maybe it should better. The hazard ratio here be 0.82. There were other factors also studied, the disease-free survival events like invasive local regional recurrences, ductal carcinoma in situ, contralateral breast carcinomas, distant metastasis in both the arms. The disease-free survival subgroup analysis showed that the denosumab played better or favorable outcome in all the pre-decided or pre-specified subgroups. Adverse events again comparable. I think the most important which they saw was probably some grade 3 hypertension maybe in 20 patients which was 1.2%, some eye disorders and some cataracts, which was seen more so in this, the hypertension, which was little more in this, and vascular disorders, which little numerically higher in the denosumab arm. Rest of the adverse events were all comparable adverse events. This study concluded that denosumab constitutes an effective and safe adjuvant treatment for patients with postmenopausal hormone receptor positive early breast cancer receiving the AI therapy. Now, coming to the patients with bone metastasis, we have been using zoledronic acid since a very, very long time, and denosumab came into clinical practice a little later, maybe. The study of this denosumab 120 milligram formulation in patients with bone metastasis, as we can see, close to 73% of the breast cancer, 83% in prostate, and almost 1/3 in lung cancer would have likely to get bone metastasis at some point of the other. And patients getting skeletal related events, the incidence in breast cancer is 64%, prostate is around 50%, and around 46% in lung cancer and other solid tumors. There was this study way back in 2010, which compared denosumab with zoledronic acid for the treatment of bone metastasis in patients with advanced breast cancer, randomized double-blind again. 2,000 patients enrolled, out of which 1,020 in zoledronic acid arm and the 1,026 in the denosumab arm. They were analyzed for efficacy, safety. You could see the Kaplan-Meier estimates. One of the first estimate was time to skeletal related events. And the second was time to first and subsequent SREs, that is multiple events, which was seen representing as a cumulative mean number of SREs over time. In both these parameters, I think denosumab scored over zoledronic acid. Here the hazard ratio in the first onset of first related event being 0.82 and significant p-value 0.01, whereas in the cumulative number of skeletal related events, again denosumab a little better as compared to zoledronic acid as far as the number of SREs and the cumulative SREs are considered. Regarding the forest plot of adverse events between the two groups, I think denosumab had a favorable adverse event profile as compared to zoledronic acid, except for toothache and hypocalcemia. We all know denosumab produces a much severe hypocalcemia as compared to zoledronic acid. Also, denosumab is fast acting and produces this hypocalcemia quite early in the course of its action. So both these drugs, zoledronic acid and denosumab, give us an option of treating our patients both in the adjuvant setting of breast cancer when we are using aromatase inhibitors in postmenopausal females to improve the bone mineral densitometry, to improve better the risk of fractures and improve the quality of life. Also, they have some favorable effect on survival, which needs to be actually evaluated in details. In the metastatic setting also, both these drugs do have a very good action in terms of prevention of skeletal related events. But when we see the trials, probably denosumab does have a upper hand in the onset of first SRE or skeletal related events and the total number of SREs, that is cumulative SREs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tushar. Very precise and concise information. Since we are a cost-sensitive country, how
Yes,
do
sir.
you place denosumab versus zoledronic acid in our case scenario? There are two case scenarios. One is metastatic breast cancer disease, in which your frequency will be to start with will be monthly for a few years,
Yes,
and
sir.
then you decrease the frequency. Second will be a non-metastatic breast cancer when you are putting the patient on adjuvant hormone therapy and you just need to reconfirm that the bone doesn't decay, when your frequency will be much longer, rather 3 monthly or 6 monthly. So what will be your choice of drugs in a cost constrained country of ours?
So in the adjuvant setting, sir, I think denosumab can be easily given to patients where probably 6 monthly frequency is what is recommended, and it is probably cost effective in terms of preventing the risk of fracture. Whereas in the metastatic setting where monthly therapies have to be given, probably even today it is for a chosen few. If there are few generics which come up, yes, we can be using it more frequently and we'll be getting better results. But yes, both the choices and options to be given to all the patients, and then probably it's a shared decision making from our side.
Any personal experience of osteonecrosis of the jaw with zoledronic acid or denosumab?
So with zoledronic acid, yes, sir, quite. I think 4 or 5 patients I've seen. So in the last 10, 11 years now.
And hypocalcemia, we have heard denosumab causes more hypocalcemia.
Yes, sir. So that has also been seen, sir. Denosumab, and very fast acting also. So probably malignant hypercalcemia, I think denosumab gives us a much better control of malignant hypercalcemia. So I think it's a good drug to use. Where zoledronic acid can take over in the 3rd or 4th day, and as early as 24 to 48 hours, the denosumab can control the hypercalcemia.
And do we have ability of 60 milligram of denosumab in India?
Yes, sir. It's available with the Intas company. I think it's available 60 mg.
So I think they have got DCGI approval only for osteoporosis, not for the breast cancer. Or
yes, sir. They've not got DCGI approval for breast cancer adjuvant treatment. But I think ortho people have been using this denosumab since I think 4 or 5 years. And if any oncologist wants to use it, yes, this can be done. It's available in the market. Sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes,
Tushar.
Thank
Thanks for your valuable addition.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Arun, we move on to the next talk then.
Yeah, we can ask Dr. Kavita could introduce the next speaker. Yeah. Dr. Kavita is there?
So I think Dr. Aparna is already online.
Dr. Aparna, I've had the opportunity to. Yeah, hi, Dr. Aparna.
I can hear you. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Dr. Aparna. So Dr. Aparna is head medical geneticist and generic counselor in Core Diagnostic Gurugram. And Dr. Aparna, I have had the opportunity to, go through some of your lectures, and they're really interesting. And since I'm keen in in molecular oncology, I always look forward to hear to you. So you can just go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Kavita. That's very kind of you. Good evening, everyone. May I have my slides, please? So on the onset, thank you organizers for having me here today. So I've been given quite the task to give you my thoughts on the application of liquid biopsy in molecular profiling, specifically in the realm of breast cancer. So without much further ado, let's get started. Next slide, please. So as physicians, you want information early and you want it accurately. And the reason being is, for patients with metastatic disease, no, don't change slides, please go back. Yeah, could you please go back? Thank you. So like I was saying, as physicians, you want information early, you want it accurately. And the reason being is for patients with metastatic disease, we know that the PFS gets shorter with each subsequent line of therapy, overall decreasing our options for these patients. So you want to treat your patient with the best therapy early, and you'd like to actually switch therapy early if it's not working. But the fundamental question then comes is does this progressive decline continue with guided treatment? And that's something that we're going to be looking into in future prospective trials. Next, please. So before we deep dive into liquid biopsy, its role in breast cancer, first let's address that, is there really a role for molecular profiling in advanced breast cancers? So with solid tumor cancers, we have learned that molecular profiling does have its benefits. Some of the lessons that we've learned is that identifying one important somatic mutation can actually make a difference. There is data to show that molecularly matched tumors with therapy actually have a better PFS and OS. Agnostic markers like MSI and TRK fusions have an excellent response and obviously a very good PFS and OS. So next, please. Patients with breast cancer, there's a very simplistic way that they are classified. The classification is based on the ER/PR and HER2 status. TNBC subtype constitutes for around 15% of our patients with treatment options of chemotherapy. Then you have the HR positive patients, which constitute around 70% of our patients, and hormone therapy is the mainstay of treatment. Then there's 15% of the HER2 positive, where anti-HER2 therapy actually improves significantly the prognostic outcome in both early and advanced settings. Next, please. But we know we've moved beyond these. Next, please. We know that we move beyond these intrinsic subtypes, we move beyond HER2 positives, luminal A's, and your basal-like subtypes. And we started to look more at genomic drivers where we've gone beyond your simple classification. We're looking at alterations in the PI3K pathway. We're looking at DNA damage repair genes. We're looking at resistance mechanisms in ER signaling pathway. And we're looking at growth receptors like FGFR1, which could potentially allow us to have more targets that can, which can help in personalized treatment strategies for patients with breast cancer. Next, please. And this is becoming so important, especially in the case of metastatic breast cancers, where the genetic landscape is very heterogeneous. As you can see on this slide, that within each of the subtypes, be it HR positive, TNBC, you have a plethora of different somatic mutations that can occur. Now, if you look at the differences between early and metastatic, you can see that there are at least 9 driver mutations. You've got TP53, ESR1, AKT, etc., which were more frequently mutated in ER positive metastatic breast cancers versus early. If you look at the triple negative subtype, we've seen an increase in the frequency of somatic biallelic loss of function in mutations that were related to homologous recombination repair. In metastatic breast cancer, you obviously saw an increase in the mutational burden and clonal diversity compared to early breast cancers. Next, please. So then the real question is, if you know the ER/PR HER2 status, can you look beyond that and look for these targeted therapies? And we know the answer is yes. We have different targets coming into clinical practice. We have a number of diagnostics and companion diagnostics that can help you determine mutations in the PI3K pathway, AKT pathway, as well as the ERK MAP kinase pathway. Next, please. So the poster child for building molecular algorithms and treatment algorithms is really lung cancer, where we know that a number of different mutations has resulted in very complex algorithms for the treatment of our patients. So what happens in breast cancer? Next, please. Now, this is a very simplistic way of looking at our breast cancer patients. This algorithm alludes to the fact that you may have basically have 3 biomarkers, ER, PR, HER2/neu. It also assumes that biomarkers stay static. We know that when the patient's tumor recurs, or when you have a patient that has a stage 4 de novo and it progresses, these biomarkers are not static. In about 30% of our patients, the ER/PR HER2/neu status could have a loss or gain of function. It's also assumed that there is only one pathway that's dominant, which again, I will show you that you really need to look at the different pathways that are activated to treat your patient. Next, please. Again, a very simplistic view of patients with metastatic TNBC. Chemotherapy is treatment option of choice. As you can see with PFS, PFS decreases with each line of therapy. Next, please. So now, if you look at the tumor biology of, let's just look at these TNBC patients, we know that they are typically associated with the worst prognostic outcome. As you can see from this heat map over here, that patients with TNBC, it's not as simple as we think it is. Even amongst this group of patients, we see subtypes like luminal AR, mesenchymal, basal immune suppressed, you've got your basal immune activated. And among each of these subtypes, what we're seeing is that they're different treatment strategies. You've got immunotherapy for basal immune activated subtypes. You've got PARP inhibitors for those with alterations in the DDR pathway. You'll have immunotherapy combinations in your basal immune suppressed subtype. And then of course, you've got your anti-androgen therapy in your luminal AR. So not so simplistic. Now, let me just complicate it a little bit more. Next, please. So in the first line setting, if you were to profile your patients with metastatic TNBC, you could in fact get an alteration in any one of these pathways. You can have a defect in the DDR pathway where you have PARP inhibitors and platinum. It has a clear role. If the AR pathway is positive, we have agents. We could have an inflamed phenotype where immunotherapy plays a role. Alterations in the PI3K pathway where we have AKT inhibitors. And last but not the least, you've got your agnostic markers like your NTRK fusions. Next, please. Now, to build my algorithm, just to give you a flavor, I've used the Impassion 130 trials. Yes, I know it's controversial for TNBCs, but what this did do, it illustrated that in the PDL1 positive cohort, there was an improvement in the overall survival as depicted in the Kaplan-Meier curves. Next, please. We also know patients with TNBC, they've got a germline BRCA mutation, and we've got this from the Olympiad and BRCA trials that alludes to the fact that if the biomarker, if you had a mutation in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 germline, a PARP inhibitor was administered, and you saw a nice separation in these Kaplan-Meier curves, favoring the group of patients that received these PARP inhibitors. Next, please. Now, this is interesting data from a phase 2 trial where TNBC patients received a combination of chemotherapy in the form of paclitaxel and capivasertib, which is a target for PIK3CA pathway and an AKT inhibitor. And again, you can see an alteration in the tumor. Where there's an alteration in the tumor, you have a nice separation of the Kaplan-Meier curves, which is favoring the patients who were getting the combination versus those tumors that did not have alterations in the pathway. Next, please. So looking at all this data, this is my proposed algorithm for metastatic TNBC based on the data I've shown you. Next, please. Then we have our HR positive, HER2 negative subtype. Now, these patients not only have ER/PR as potential biomarkers, but we also need to look at different pathways, such as those that acquire an ESR1 mutation. Now, we know that agents like aromatase inhibitors do not work well, so you need to look at agents such as fulvestrant. Next, please. So I think especially in the HR positive patients, understanding the biology of the disease is extremely important. Reason being, patients do acquire the endocrine resistance, and you can have, like over here, this animation shows, very beautifully illustrates that patients who had endocrine resistant or endocrine sensitive, the tumors have a small subclones of, ESR1 mutation, which accounts for around 18% of cases where it's acquired. You have 13% that have a problem or defect in the MAP kinase pathway, then around 9% of acquired mutations in the MYC pathway. These acquired genomic alterations eventually result in endocrine resistance. And the real question that comes is, could these evolutionary tracks actually influence the choice of subsequent therapy? And as we know, we are implementing it in our clinics. It does influence therapy. Next, please. Now, we also know, in addition to this, that some somatic mutations differ between early and late or metastatic breast cancer, especially in our ER positive subtype. And one of the things that has been very interesting in the last couple of years is the identification, the development of tumors acquiring an ApoBec signature, or tumor, where the tumor mutation burden is high in your ER positive patients. So could this be a potential biomarker? Well, in ASCO 2018, I think, next slide, please. There was a very nice case study that was presented where a patient was initially diagnosed in 2001 with ER positive breast cancer, had appropriate treatment for early breast cancer, and eventually there was a recurrence in 2010. And then you can see over here, after multiple lines of therapy, in 2015, they found an ApoBec high signature, and she was eventually treated with a combination of pembrolizumab and chemotherapy, and the patient did respond. So, something to think about for the future. Next, please. We've also seen the results of the SOLO-1 trials, which was a phase 3 clinical trial studying patients with HR positive, HER2 negative, and metastatic breast cancer. Now, this was amongst patients that had a PIK3CA mutation and they were given a combination of fulvestrant and alpelisib, which is a PIK3CA inhibitor, and you saw a very good response. And the interesting thing was, it didn't really matter that if this mutation was, you did a liquid biopsy or a tissue biopsy, both were applicable in this particular trial, both were used in this trial. Next, please. And like I've said before, you can acquire a HER2 mutation. And over time, we've seen this more in patients with HR positive breast cancer. Now, this was a phase 3 summit trial that took patients with HR positive, HER2 mutant breast cancer and gave them a combination of niraparib and fulvestrant. They were obviously heavily pretreated patients. And this combination did result in a clinical benefit rate of 47% and a PFS of around 5.4 months. Next, please. So as per this data, this is my proposed algorithm of when a patient comes in with HR positive, HER2 negative in my clinic. Next, please. So we know that ESMO has actually come out with a scale for clinical actionability for molecular targets specifically for breast cancer. And you can see that level 1, level 2 evidence tends to be in terms of looking for an HER2 amplification, a germline BRCA mutation, PIK3CA, MSI, NTRK, ESR1, PTEN loss, AKT mutations, your ERBB2 point mutations. Next, please. And in addition to this, we also have a plethora of different targets which has less evidence that supports it, but we still look at them as they are clinical clinical trials that are investigating it. Next, please. So now that we've addressed the main question, we do know that molecular profiling is essential in breast cancer. So what is the role of liquid biopsy specifically in breast cancer? How can we use liquid biopsy in this in breast cancer? Next, please. So we do know that heterogeneity, both inter and intratumoral, does cause a problem when you are trying to trace those biomarkers in your patients. And one way to be able to look at the genomic landscape is using liquid biopsy. Essentially, what you're doing is you're going to isolate the circulating tumor DNA, which is the somatic DNA that gets lysed from the tumor cell, gets lysed into the blood from the tumor cell. You isolate those and you study that. So it's your somatic DNA. Now, there's also circulating tumor cells, which is essentially an intact cell that gets discarded from the primary site. And there's a lot of research there, especially in the realm of breast cancer. But for today's talk, I'm just going to be focusing on circulating tumor DNA. Next, please. So how can we use liquid biopsies to help with metastatic breast cancer patients? Well, we could actually detect two types of resistance mechanisms. One would be by looking at the linear clonal evolution, which basically involves tumor cells, where you have a temporal evolution where you have one dominant clone which eventually loses its dominancy, and you have another one which was not dominant and becomes dominant. And this is just a cycle that, it goes on, and then over time, it gets selected out by therapies. Now, the second one is branch clonal evolution, where you have a spatial evolution in terms of divergence of different clones. And what happens is that you essentially get a mixture of different cancer cells resulting in resistance. Next, please. So we can use liquid biopsies in various aspects of clinical practice, screening and recurrence. There's some really good data over there, but it's not ready for clinical practice. But what we can do is that we can use it today in a metastatic disease, where we can, address issues with enhanced longitudinal monitoring. You can do tumor profiling. From that, you can have tailored drug therapies, treatment responses, resistance monitoring. And I think something very important is addressing the heterogeneity assessment by capturing the entire tumor genome. Next, please. So one of the main questions that we tend to ask ourselves is, what is the clinical utility? What is the benefit of actually looking at the circulating tumor DNA in metastatic disease versus why not just profile the primary tumor? And I get this question so many times in my clinic from physicians. And this was interestingly one of the main objectives in the MIRROR study. And what they did was they wanted to evaluate the concordance of genomic variants between the primary tumor tissue, the metastatic tumor tissue, and the circulating tumor DNA in patients with metastatic breast cancer. And what we saw was that out of the 107 of the 110 variants identified in primary and metastatic tumors were also detected in ctDNA, a 97.2 concordance, which basically says that liquid biopsies is a reliable platform. There were 13 variants in metastatic tissue and ctDNA, which was not present in primary tumor, because as the tumor becomes metastatic, there is heterogeneity, there is clonality. So that's why the difference. And interestingly enough, ctDNA can also be used to detect genomic alterations in patients with metastatic breast cancer. Next, please. Now, I know that even though there is a huge overlap, there is a good concordance between tissue and liquid, and we just saw 97.3%, but they can also be discordant, albeit it is rare, but it can happen. So should you opt in a metastatic case to go in for a liquid biopsy? And if a variant is detected, you treat accordingly. Now, if a variant is not detected, and this is one of the flowcharts that they used in the MIRROR study, was that they went in for doing a tissue biopsy. Now, if they did a repeat biopsy or they tested on the archival tumor, I don't recommend archival tumor, especially in a metastatic setting. And if a variant was detected, they went and treated based on that variant, else they just found an alternative therapy. Next, please. This talk would be absolutely incomplete if I did not talk about the 2019 SABS, the plasma match that was presented in 2019 in SABS. And it's possibly one of the largest studies that looked at ctDNA with patients on metastatic breast cancer. It was an open label, multi-central, multi-cohort trial where ctDNA was tested in over 1,000 patients. And what was very interesting is that, we've got so many studies in lung and colorectal, but this was the first one dedicated only for breast cancer. After the patients underwent molecular profiling, they got subdivided based on their mutations. You had your ESR1 mutations, HER2 mutations, AKT mutations, those that were negative for a mutation. Next, please. The study did show that next slide, please. So the study did show that the overall response rates were really good based on, early identification of these mutations. But for me, the key takeaway was, next, please, that it also compared the sensitivity of liquid biopsy versus, paired tumor tissue testing, and an overall sensitivity of 93%. In addition, what it also did is it took ddPCR as a platform and NGS, and here the Guardant 360 test was used. And it did a head-on-head comparison. And again, the Guardant 360 platform did come out at the top with having the highest sensitivity and specificity. Again, reiterating the fact that liquid biopsies can be used in metastatic breast cancer. Next, please. I just need another 2 minutes and I'm done. So the real question was, could you really detect these driver mutations for treatment of resistance mutations early versus tissue? And I like this. This was a very nice, this was from MSK. It was presented back in 2008, a case study. And I'm just going to focus on the ESR1. Now, when this patient's ESR1 was tested on tumor on Feb 2015 and July 2015, it was in July 2015 that they actually were able to detect the ESR1 mutation. Vis-a-vis, if you look at the plasma ctDNA, which was done in the same around the same time in Feb 2015, they were able to detect early resistance. Again, reiterating that liquid biopsies may be a good option for metastatic cases. Next, please. So earlier on, I showed you results of the SOLO-1 trials where patients with a PIK3CA mutation were treated with fulvestrant and alpelisib, and they had a good PFS. Now, this gets you thinking that are there other markers within this group of patients that could allow you to tease out those who would and who would not respond to alpelisib? So this was an excellent paper that came out last year, and I thought in Nature Cancer, and so very, very important. What they did is that they looked at alterations in PTEN and ESR1 that could potentially promote clinical resistance to a combination of alpelisib with the aromatase inhibitor. And what the author showed was that at baseline, you sequence the tumor of your patient, and you would not really see a clinical benefit if there was a PTEN or an ESR1 mutation. And as we know that you can't, you don't always acquire a mutation at baseline. So what they did, you really acquire it over a period of time, and they used ctDNA to do it at pre and post test of progression. And based on this analysis, what they saw was that presence of ESR1 and PTEN mutations could actually indicate resistance to the combination of anti-estrogen and PI3K inhibitors. Next, please. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that HER2 mutations can be acquired in an endocrine-resistant cohort. And this is actually a very nice, again, this is just a clinical study to show you where liquid biopsies can actually be used to call out these acquired mutations over time. This is an excellent example where a patient underwent multiple liquid biopsies. When they found an HER2 mutation, they were treated accordingly. You can see there was a 37% decrease in the liver lesions. When they did the next liquid biopsy, molecular profiling, they saw a disappearance of the HER2 mutant clones. They saw a partial decrease in the ESR1 mutant clones. So what they saw was that driver HER2 mutant alleles that emerged during blood-based monitoring of endocrine-resistant metastatic breast cancers could actually confer to the fact that, novel therapeutic vulnerability. Next, please. Now, then the question comes that who gives you a better prognostic outcome, tissue versus liquid? This was a nice study that was done this was actually presented, at ASCO in 2018, where they did ctDNA versus tissue genotyping. And yes, I do know that the tissue was less in number versus ctDNA. But what was interesting was that we take this with a pinch of salt, I will say that, but 84% of mutations were detected in ctDNA, and only 66% actionable mutations were detected in tissue genotyping. So if you look at it, 31.1% of patients were molecularly matched in ctDNA versus just a 25.5% patients that were molecularly matched in tissue DNA, using tissue genotyping, Next, please. So I've given you all these this data. At the end of the day, to conclude, this is what I do when a physician calls me or a patient gets referred to my cancer genetics clinic. Next, please. This is my last slide. If it's a newly diagnosed case, newly diagnosed metastatic case, the first question is molecular profiling required? If it's not, we wait till the disease the disease progresses, and then we have the option of doing tissue or liquid. If I don't get an answer on one, I do like trying the other in an ideal setup. I know cost is an issue in India, so I mean, both the platforms are available. Both are good platforms to use, liquid and tissue. Again, if you do say that molecular profiling is required upfront, you can go in either for tissue and liquid and just do molecular profiling and hopefully have a result and give the patient personalized therapy. Next, please. On that note, thank you so much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna. It was a wonderful presentation, very informative, very educative. But yeah, we could understand that the ctDNA and the CTCs can be helpful in metastatic settings. Of course, we can come to we can learn about the resistance even by the ctDNA. Okay. But one question I would like to ask you is, do they help us in cases where if we have a patient who's diagnosed with early breast cancer, early breast cancer? So is there anything where we can follow up a patient with a CTC or a ctDNA to know whether they are at a high risk of, getting a recurrence or metastasis?
That's actually a very good question. Thank you. So if I just heard you right, I'm just going to, so you're asking in an early breast cancer setup if we can use liquid biopsies for monitoring. Is that right? Is that what you're asking me?
In early breast cancers, whether CTC, you can use CTCs to follow up a patient whether she's at high risk of recurrence or not, or any, we can follow the mutation. The tumor mutations on ctDNA.
Okay, so yes, it is pretty early stage. It is in its early. I don't think it's really being applied in our clinics as of yet now, but in early stage breast cancer, we can use circulating tumor DNA right from the point of diagnosis, and as the patient undergoes treatment or even post surgery, to monitor it, create a baseline and monitor it like every 3 months, 6 months, depending on how high the CTC count is. That is one mechanism of monitoring. I don't think this test can tell you the risk of recurrence as to how quickly the disease can come back, the patient can have a relapse. I don't think a CTC is equipped for that. But what it can do is, based on the CTC count, that's once you establish a baseline, it can tell you if the disease is progressing, if there is tumor, it can give you a premonition of a potential relapse, but it cannot predict a recurrence. It can't tell you like how an Oncotype DX will give you a risk factor and say 60%, 20%, and based on that you understand the risk of recurrence and all. This cannot, CTCs cannot do that. And ctDNA can only be used if you know that there is a potential biomarker. Like if I know that a patient has a TP53 mutation, for example, and at the time of diagnosis, let's say the variant allele frequency for that, it was 20%, and post-therapy it comes down to 6%. So maybe you can use ctDNA from that perspective of monitoring the VAF, like the percentage of that particular mutation. But again, it's not in the guidelines. It's just applying the, it's just looking and trying to get a real-time view of what's happening with the patient's tumor. But it really depends from case to case also. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I just...
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thank all three of you. All the speakers were really very good, and they made us understand their topics also. And as there is no question in chat box, so I think we will hand over in time back to the organizer, and thank you to give us this chance.